They sang until their voices bled. That was how the first report began. A phrase that no one seemed to understand, because no one had been there to witness the beginning of it. It was June of 1953, the air heavy with the kind of heat that sticks to the bones, and the small farming town of New Bell Hollow prepared for another uneventful Sunday. The roads were dust, the fields were low, and the church bell of St. Matthew's had not missed a ring in 40 years. It was a town suspended in ritual, bound together by the simplicity of habit and hymn. The Reverend Thomas Avery was a man of measured voice and immaculate posture. He had preached to the same faces for 2 decades, a congregation small enough to name by sight. That morning they gathered as always, families in pressed cotton, the old women with gloved hands folded on hymnals, the choir perched neatly behind the pulpit like an ornament of faith. The choir was the pride of the town. 12 voices practiced without ambition, singing the same songs every Sunday as if the words themselves held the world in place. At precisely 11:42, the Reverend paused mid-sermon. Some would later say it was because of the light. The morning had turned harsh, the sun cutting through the stained glass with a brilliance that seemed unnatural. He faltered, hands tightening around the lectern, mouth parted mid-sentence. A few thought he was struck ill. Others said they heard him whisper something. A word, a prayer, or perhaps nothing at all. Then he was gone. The space behind the pulpit stood empty. No one saw him leave. No sound of a door or footstep followed. He had simply ceased to be there. For a moment silence claimed the church. The choir remained seated, the congregation waiting for someone to move. And then, as if guided by an invisible thread, one of the sopranos began to hum. It was a soft sound at first, hesitant, fragile, like a child unsure of a melody. Then another voice joined, and another, until all 12 rose together in unison. Their hymn was familiar, "Abide with Me," the kind of song that clung to funerals and late evenings. They sang it through once, and when it ended they began again. No one asked them to stop. The service dissolved into confusion. Some of the parishioners left, assuming shock had overcome them. Others lingered, waiting for the pastor to return. But the choir did not falter. By nightfall, the doors of St. Matthew's were still open, and the voices still carried through the valley. It was not until the next morning that the sheriff came to lock the doors, only to find them bolted from within. Through the cracks of the stained glass windows, he could hear the same song. Slower now, wearied, but still rising and falling like breath. When he called out, there was no reply. By the second day, the town had gathered in quiet disbelief. The sound filled every corner of the hollow, a constant thread of human endurance stitched through the air. Windows stayed shut. Livestock went unfed. Mothers shushed their children as if the singing were sacred or contagious. Those who had once sat beside those same voices at picnics and weddings now spoke of them in whispers. The mayor sent for help from the next county, a priest, a doctor, anyone who could explain what had gripped the singers of St. Matthew's. But no explanation arrived, only the sound that never ceased. Inside, it was said the choir stood still between pews, hymnals clasped open to the same page, their faces pale, their lips cracked, their eyes unfocused. Yet they sang on, the same hymn repeating in a loop that defied exhaustion. No one dared break the lock. On the third morning, a young boy claimed he saw light leaking through the roof, faint, pulsing like the embers of a dying fire. When asked what color it was, he answered that it wasn't any color he'd seen before, just something that felt like the inside of a voice. By then, the song had changed. No longer the clean harmonies of Sunday mornings, it now rolled and swelled in uneven waves. An old language without words, the sound of something learning to grieve. Those who stood near the doors said the air trembled, that it pressed against the chest like the weight of confession. The sheriff, unable to bear it, ordered the doors forced open. But when the men tried, the hinges seemed fused, the wood refused to splinter, and the stained glass vibrated with the resonance of the song. Some said they could feel the words beneath their feet, like echoes moving through the earth. At dusk on the third day, the singing stopped. It ended not with a note, but with the kind of silence that feels earned. No one spoke. No bird stirred. The valley exhaled, as if waking from a dream. When they finally broke inside, the pews were empty. Only the choir robes remained, neatly folded on the benches, each one marked with dried blood along the collar where the throat would have been. Hymnals lay scattered, pages damp, words half-faded. Of Reverend Avery there was still no sign. The investigation that followed amounted to nothing. No bodies, no evidence, no sound left behind, except for the faint residue of singing that some swore still lingered in the air long after the doors were opened. The church was sealed, then abandoned. The grass grew tall around its foundation, and the road to New Bell Hollow fell from the maps. But locals say that on hot summer nights, when the wind carries through the valley, you can still hear it, a thread of harmony rising from where the church once stood. Not loud, not clear, just the faint murmur of a hymn without words. Some claim it is memory, others madness, but those who were there remember it differently. They remember the moment the pastor vanished and how the world forgot to breathe. They remember the first note that filled the silence. And above all, they remember the sound of faith turning into something else, something endless. They sang until their voices bled. By the time the second dawn rose over New Bell Hollow, the sound had already become part of the landscape. It wove itself through the wind, into the rusted tin roofs and the trees that leaned over the narrow dirt road leading to St. Matthew's Church. What began as song had become something else. A current, a pulse of endurance, too constant to ignore and too strange to name. The first night had left the townsfolk sleepless. They listened through their walls, the notes slipping in through cracks like candle smoke. Even from miles away, the sound reached the edge of every home. A reminder that something human was still happening, though no one could say why. In the beginning there was comfort in it, familiar voices, familiar hymns. The choir of St. Matthew's had always been steady, a metronome of faith that marked their Sundays like the turning of the seasons, but repetition breeds unease. By midday, the pattern of the song no longer matched anything known. The melody blurred, the rhythm stretched. What had been praise now felt like something forced, like prayer recited through fever. There were no pauses for breath, no moments of silence. The sound carried on without break, relentless, circular, refusing any resolution. The sheriff sat outside the church for most of that day, hat pulled low, a thermos of coffee in his lap. Through the window slats, he could see the faintest shimmer of movement, shoulders swaying, hands clutching hymnals to their chests. But the faces, when glimpsed, looked wrong in the dim light, pale, drained eyes unfocused. They sang not to be heard, but because silence had become unbearable. By the second night, the song no longer sounded like a choir. It was a tide of layered voices, human yet distant, rising and falling like breathing. At times it seemed to retreat, fading into stillness, only to surge again in a single unified swell. The townspeople began to hear it even when it wasn't there. The pitch lived behind their ears, the echo thrumming in their throats when they spoke. At the diner, where the last of the townsfolk gathered, conversation fell into whispers. A woman said she dreamed of the church roof lifting like a bell, the voices spilling upward into the clouds. Another swore she'd found her husband humming in his sleep, the same melody, lips moving soundlessly. The local pastor from the next county arrived by horse the following morning. He brought with him a small Bible and the kind of skepticism that comes from city parishes. But when he heard the sound for himself, he refused to enter. He said it wasn't singing anymore, that it was something older than words, something using the bodies of the faithful to make itself known. Inside, no one knew what time meant. The windows were shuttered, the candles had burned down to nubs. The air was thick with breath and incense and sweat. Their voices cracked but never faltered. The choir director, a man named Harold, had once been proud of his ability to hold a pitch longer than any in the county fair contests. By the end of that second day, his throat was bleeding, his shirt front stained. Yet his mouth kept forming the same vowels, the same drawn-out syllables that no longer belonged to any language known on earth. Something had broken, not in him alone, but in all of them together. Outside, a group of young men from the farms tried to force the doors again. They managed to wedge one open an inch before stopping. The air that escaped was not heat or incense, but something dense and cold, like the breath of a cellar left sealed for generations. They dropped their tools trembling. One of them vomited in the grass. They said the sound was different up close. Not a song, but a vibration that passed through the bones, shaking loose something unnamed. The sheriff wanted to burn it down. The mayor forbade it, and so they waited, sitting in their trucks along the hill, smoking in silence, listening to the endless song. By nightfall, the church windows glowed faintly again, a trembling gold, not from candlelight, but from something within. The color pulsed in rhythm with the voices, like the heartbeat of the building itself. No one spoke of it aloud, but each who saw it felt the same thought rise unbidden, that the singers were no longer singing to God, but for Him, as if their voices were being used in ways they could not refuse. The town began to change. Those who had been closest to the church grew restless. They could not sleep, could not eat. When they did close their eyes, they dreamed of standing in front of the choir, mouths open, singing though no sound came out. Some woke to find their jaws aching, their throats raw. A few wandered into the fields at night, humming softly, eyes distant. Children began to mimic the sound in play, standing in circles, holding hands, repeating the rising pattern until their parents tore them apart. Dogs refused to go near the church road. Horses spooked and broke free from their fences. By the third day it was no longer a town, but a listening post for something vast and unseen. The people became attendants of the sound, caught between awe and horror. The diner stopped serving food. The gas station closed. Every conversation ended with someone glancing toward the valley, listening for the next shift in tone. And yet, beneath the fear, a strange reverence grew. Some began to think it holy, that perhaps the choir had been chosen, that their voices were keeping the world from falling apart. One farmer built a small cross from fence wood and placed it by the church gate. Another left bread on the steps. Faith was turning to fever. When the sun dipped below the ridge that final evening, the sound began to thin. The voices wavered, no longer unified. The notes dragged apart like threads pulled from cloth. Then, in a single moment, not loud, not grand, but quiet and absolute, the music stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. Those who stood outside said they could still hear it in their heads for hours afterward. When they finally opened the doors, the church was empty as it had been before. The air inside was cool, the floor slick with something clear and faintly sweet. On the altar, a single hymnal lay open to the final page of "Abide with Me." The words blurred, smudged by tears or sweat or something older than both. The sheriff closed the doors again and nailed them shut. He said it was finished, but that night in every house in New Bell Hollow, men and women woke at the same moment, the same hour, the same breath, with the taste of iron on their tongues, and the faint echo of music still humming in their bones. The silence that followed should have been a mercy, but it wasn't. In the days after the song ended, New Bell Hollow felt hollow in more ways than name. The air seemed emptied, as though the voices had taken something with them when they vanished. Even the insects fell quiet, as if the world itself was waiting for the next verse. The sheriff sealed the church with his own hands. 6 nails on each door, driven through wood that still trembled faintly, like a body refusing death. He told the townsfolk to go home, to rest, to stop talking about it. But people do not recover from miracles, nor from the absence that follows them. For a while the story stayed local, a whisper traded in stores, a caution told in kitchens. But by the end of summer, word had reached the county seat and then the state. A journalist arrived first, young, ambitious, with a voice too loud for a place that had forgotten how to speak. He brought a recorder and a camera, and he spent 2 days knocking on doors that did not open. He found the sheriff sitting on the church steps, cigarette burning to ash between his fingers. The man refused questions but allowed the journalist to stand with him in silence. They both listened, though there was nothing to hear. When the tape played back later, there was a faint hum underneath, a low tone, steady and distant, like a choir practicing behind stone walls. That was enough. The papers called it hysteria, rural superstition, a collective trauma shaped by faith and isolation. Psychologists were quoted, priests consulted, sociologists pontificated on the power of communal delusion. But none of them came to see the place themselves. None of them stood under that lingering hush that bent the air around St. Matthew's. A week later, a team from the university arrived. 3 men and a woman in pressed suits and careful expressions. They took samples from the floorboards, from the walls, from the air. They measured sound frequencies that did not exist and photographed light that refused to capture properly. When they left, they said nothing, though one of them, the youngest, was seen burning his notes in the motel parking lot that night. The sheriff quit soon after. He packed a single bag and left town before dawn. No one saw him again. Without him, the town drifted. The church became a shadow people avoided even in thought. Crops withered, wells turned metallic, children spoke less. The few who remained grew pale and tired, as if still holding their breath from the days of singing. Then came the government men, dark cars, darker suits. They spoke to no one, stayed for 3 days and left without a trace of what they found. The local paper printed one final headline, St. Matthew's to be demolished pending investigation. But the demolition never came. Autumn passed into frost, and the church stood untouched. The doors remained sealed, though the nails had rusted to the color of dried blood. The windows clouded from within, as though something breathed against the glass from the other side. It was the following spring when the first of the townsfolk began to return to the valley after fleeing. They found the grass grown tall, the road reclaimed by roots. The sound was gone, but the feeling remained. That if one listened closely enough, the air still carried the memory of harmony. In the county archives, an old clerk kept the police reports. Pages filled with guesses, carbon monoxide poisoning, shared psychosis, sonic resonance, divine punishment. None explained the blood on the robes or the vanished bodies. The final entry simply read, Case concluded, unexplainable. But legends do not obey paperwork. Years later, travelers passing through would ask about the place. A few locals would point to the hollow, though most pretended not to remember. The road remained overgrown, the sign for St. Matthew's reduced to a splintered post. Some nights, hunters claimed they heard music drifting faintly from the hills, not full voices, just a trace of melody carried by the wind. Always the same refrain, always unfinished. One farmer, the last of the original families, kept a hymnal from the church locked in his barn. He said he found it years after the incident, half buried near the creek. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the final verse of "Abide with me" was still legible. Across the margin, written in what looked like pencil but had not smudged in decades, were the words, "We sing so he won't return." No one knew whose hand had written it. The farmer never opened the book again. In the state archives, the church was officially listed as condemned property, though the paperwork was unsigned. The land passed into private ownership, then lapsed into neglect. The photographs taken during the investigation of the empty pews, the robes, the altar, were misplaced in storage. Only one remained, preserved accidentally by a journalist who later left the profession entirely. It showed the interior of St. Matthew's, lit by the faint spill of sunlight through the high window. On the floor, in dust thick as ash, were 12 footprints leading away from the choir stand and stopping in the center aisle. They did not turn, they did not scatter. They ended cleanly, mid-step, as if the singers had walked into air and vanished. No one has entered since. When storms pass over the hollow, the wind still finds the old boards, drawing faint tones from the cracks and holes where glass once stood. To the ear, it sounds like music, thin, wavering, too human to be natural. Those who have heard it say it comes not from the church itself, but from the air above it, as if something unseen still hovers, waiting for the next breath to begin the hymn again. Faith ends in silence, but silence remembers, and in that memory, the choir of St. Matthew's still stands, their mouths open to a God who never answered, their song echoing through a world that forgot them. Time dulled the edges of New Bell Hollow, but it never erased the sound. Decades later, the story of the endless choir drifted between footnotes and folklore, changing shape with each retelling. Historians treated it as rural hysteria, the kind born in closed rooms and strict faith. Theologians quoted it in sermons about endurance and temptation, but beneath the academic polish, a quieter current remained, one that refused to explain itself away. In 1971, a graduate student from the State University reopened the file. His thesis was meant to trace the psychology of collective religious ecstasy, but every path led back to the hollow. He drove out on a grey November morning and found the road half swallowed by trees. The church was still there, roof sagging, doors chained. Inside the chain's rust, he thought he could hear a faint hum when the wind passed. He stayed until dusk, took photographs that came out blank, and returned with a fever that never left him. His paper was never published, but his notes contained a single line scrawled at the bottom of the page. Harmony persists beyond witness. Others followed. In the 80s, a sound engineer came searching for what he called residual resonance. He placed recording equipment around the perimeter, leaving reels spinning through the night. When he played them back, the noise was constant, static shaped like breathing. On the third reel, beneath the hiss, 12 frequencies appeared, each rising and falling in measured intervals. They matched the vocal range of a human choir. The church was declared unsafe soon after, fenced off by the county, yet that only deepened its allure. Pilgrims arrived in secret, lighting candles along the roadside. Some claimed they could still feel vibrations through the earth, faint as the aftershock of thunder. A few swore they heard their own names whispered in the harmonies. The Vatican received a report in 1989 through a missionary archive. an inquiry asking whether continuous song could be considered a form of sustained prayer. The answer returned weeks later, handwritten, unsigned. The body may perish while the prayer remains. No one in the parish could identify who had written it. As the years passed, the hollow entered the language of fear. Documentary filmmakers came and went, finding only wind and ruin. Psychologists wrote of sonic contagion, of trance and trauma, amplified by isolation. Their conclusions were reasonable, yet none addressed the impossible duration. The 72 hours of unbroken sound without food, water, or breath. A physicist from the East Coast proposed a theory of harmonic standing waves trapped in the valley's geography. He said the choir had become instruments of a natural phenomenon, but when he visited to measure it, his equipment failed. The readings looped endlessly, as if the data itself refused to conclude. By the 90s, the legend resurfaced online. Grainy photographs circulated, claiming to show faint silhouettes inside the church, light pooling where no windows remained. Threads of speculation grew. Some said the reverend had led his choir into ascension, others that something had spoken through them. Feeding on sound instead of flesh among the locals, a quieter belief survived, that the singers had never left, only crossed into a space where song replaced speech, where worship required no witness. They said the hollow still thrummed because faith, once set in motion, could not die of hunger or time. In the town records office, a clerk digitizing old files found a fragment misfiled among tax receipts. A typewritten paragraph labeled Supplementary Observation, June 1953. It described a low frequency detected throughout the county during those 3 days, powerful enough to disrupt radio signals, but confined entirely to a radius of 1 mile around St. Matthew's. The last sentence was redacted with black ink, but when held to the light, 2 words bled through: human origin. Theories multiplied like hymns rewritten by memory. Some argued the choir had achieved a collective trance akin to martyrdom. Others believed they had been caught in the gravitational echo of their own devotion, unable to stop until belief exhausted them. A fringe theologian published a small book asserting that the event proved divinity was acoustic, that God was vibration, and the singers had resonated themselves into his frequency. He was excommunicated quietly a year later. Every decade someone returns to the hollow. They arrive with instruments or prayers, always leaving with silence pressed into them like a bruise. The fence has long since fallen. Vines crawl through the broken windows. Inside, the pews have collapsed into rot, yet the air feels heavy, charged. Those who linger long enough report a faint tightening in the chest, as if the atmosphere itself expects a note that will never come. A scientist once placed a stethoscope to the floor and claimed to hear rhythm, slow, steady beneath the boards, as though 12 hearts were still beating far below the ground. No proof survives, only patterns of absence. In recent years, the legend has softened into metaphor. Pastors quote it to warn of pride disguised as faith. Musicians reference it as the sound that refuses to end. But on certain recordings made near the hollow, a background tone can still be heard, faint and constant. When analyzed, the frequency aligns perfectly with the final note of "Abide with me." Even now, scholars argue over meaning. Was it miracle, madness, or something that defies both? Perhaps it was all three. A final chord struck between belief and flesh, echoing still because no one dared name it. Faith becomes echo. Echo becomes record. Record becomes myth. And in that unbroken lineage, the choir of St. Matthew's remains suspended, caught forever between the last breath and the first note. Proof that silence itself can remember the shape of devotion. The last known mention of the hollow came not from a priest or historian, but from a podcaster. He called himself a documentarian of forgotten faiths, a seeker of the strange residue belief leaves behind. In the autumn of 2019, he arrived with a microphone, a camera, and a hunger that had nothing to do with fame. He said he'd grown up not far from the valley, and that the silence of it had followed him his whole life. He parked his car at the edge of the overgrown road, half swallowed by briar and oak. The air felt colder there, the kind of stillness that suggests listening rather than absence. The church's roof sagged deeper now, cruciform beams canted toward collapse. Moss covered the stone plaque where St. Matthew's name had once been etched. He began to record, not sound at first, but breath, steps, the crunch of leaves. Then after an hour, the faint vibration reached him, a low, pulsing hum. It came from beneath the soil, steady as a heartbeat. He placed his microphone down and let the tape roll. On playback later it would reveal nothing, but in the moment he felt it in his chest, an invisible pressure, the air dense with a single unfinished note. He entered through the side door where the hinges had rotted away. Inside, the nave was stripped of everything sacred. Pews gone, altar devoured by mildew. Yet the walls carried faint traces of hymns, the ghost outlines of music scores pinned there 70 years ago. He found scraps of hymnals fused together by time, their pages half melted by moisture, notes and words indistinguishable. At the center of the floor was a hollow depression, like a footprint in stone. When he stepped inside, the pressure in his ears deepened, and the hum sharpened to pitch. It was a single tone, clear as a tuning fork. It seemed to come not from air, but from memory itself. Vibrating through the bones of the place, he whispered the name of the vanished pastor, and though the room stayed still, the sound swelled in reply, a chord faintly layered, 12 voices folding over one another. Each note quivered, indistinct, as though remembering what it had once been. He stood very still, knowing that to speak again might invite an answer he could not bear. Night came quickly. The church dissolved into darkness. He set his recorder near the old altar and left it running as he slept in the car. At dawn, he retrieved it and drove home without listening. Only weeks later, editing the episode, did he press play. The first hour was empty. Then came the tone, soft, steady, almost imperceptible. But under it another rhythm emerged, syncopated like breathing, followed by what might have been a human voice, humming a fragment of melody, the same melody that ended, "Abide with me." He slowed the tape, enhanced the waveform, filtered the frequencies. 12 distinct layers appeared, not static, not interference. 12 human tones intertwined in unison. When the final note faded, a silence remained so pure it felt deliberate. He replayed it dozens of times until he noticed something that had not been there before. A 13th voice, faint, behind the rest, whispering between the breaths of sound. The words were indistinct at first, then clear enough to transcribe. "Stay with us." The podcaster never released the recording. His channel fell silent. Months later, a friend found his apartment abandoned, coffee half finished on the desk, equipment still running. On the computer, a single file remained untitled, time-stamped exactly 72 hours after his last upload. It was an audio track 24 minutes long. The waveform was shaped like a hymn. Authorities retrieved the hard drive, but found nothing when they played it. Blank silence, no measurable data. Yet sound technicians reported an anomaly. A constant resonance between channels, audible only through contact headphones. They described it as pressure more than sound, the sense of being surrounded by a living tone. One technician refused to return the device to storage, claiming he could hear words emerging from the resonance when he was alone at night. The file was destroyed, but copies had already circulated. In certain corners of the internet, listeners claimed to possess fragments. They describe the same sensation, an urge to hum along as though the recording expects participation. Some say that once you listen, silence never feels the same again. The valley itself has changed little. Satellite images show the church reduced to foundation stones, the surrounding trees bent inward, their pattern almost circular. On windless days, hikers report a faint choral swell rising from beneath the ground, soft enough to be mistaken for the rustle of leaves. Researchers who study auditory hallucination have attempted to frame it as mass suggestion. They speak of expectation, of myth-shaping perception, yet none explain the consistent frequency, always the same, recorded decades apart by unrelated instruments. There are those who believe the choir still sings, not as voices, but as vibration trapped in the architecture of the earth, faith rendered into frequency, sound turned relic. The last surviving witness, a woman who had been a child in the congregation, was interviewed in a nursing home not long before she died. Her memory drifted between lucidity and sleep. But when the interviewer asked what she remembered of those days, she smiled faintly and began to hum. Her voice was fragile, paper-thin, but the tone was unmistakable. When asked how long they had sung, she lifted her eyes to the ceiling, as if listening to something only she could hear. "We never stopped," she said. Then her voice dissolved into silence, and the recording ended with the faint impression of another tone joining hers, distant and pure. The tape is archived in an unnamed collection at the State University. Every few years, researchers digitize the file to preserve it. Each new version introduces a slight distortion, a low harmonic that wasn't present before. It builds across decades like a hidden chorus rising through time. And perhaps that is the truth of it, that belief never ends, only changes medium. From lungs to tape, from tape to memory, from memory to frequency. The song continues, stripped of congregation, pastor, or purpose, echoing through the fabric of the air itself. Those who stand in the hollow after dark still feel it. They say the silence presses against their ribs until breath aligns with an unseen rhythm. They say the earth beneath them vibrates like a living throat. And for a moment, brief, unbearable, they understand the kind of devotion that can outlast death. The final echo of St. Matthew's is not music, nor miracle. It is what remains when both refuse to end.